Okay, so today's lesson is we're going to start looking at cellular respiration. Cellular respiration occurs in both plant and animal cells, whereas when we were looking at photosynthesis, it only occurred in like the plant cells and in chloroplasts. So what we saw with photosynthesis was that, oh, one second. All right, so what we saw in photosynthesis was during photosynthesis, carbon dioxide gets reduced to glucose. Electrons and hydrogen ions are chemically added to carbon dioxide to produce high energy glucose molecules. So here now, cellular respiration, we can see our summary equation down here. So we have the glucose plus oxygen is producing carbon dioxide, 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, and then energy is being released as ATP. So cellular respiration releases the energy of these glucose molecules by oxidizing glucose to carbon dioxide. So oxidizing electrons and hydrogen ions are removed from glucose, releasing energy and producing carbon dioxide and water. All right, so just a quick review of reduction, which is gain of electrons and hydrogen. Oxidation is the loss of hydrogen and electrons. And we can see both of that happening in these two equations. So the summary equations for photosynthesis and cellular respiration are sometimes written like this, just to show what's happening with the carbon dioxide. But notice that if you do multiply all the chemical formulas by 6, then you would get the summary equation for the processes. So there's 3 pathways for energy release. There's aerobic cellular respiration. That's the first pathway. This is occurring in an environment that contains oxygen. All right, so that's what aerobic means. It means that oxygen is required to produce ATP. So this occurs in animals, plants, many types of fungi, protists, and bacteria will use aerobic cellular respiration for energy. There's another pathway, it's anaerobic. This means this process is not requiring oxygen to produce ATP, and this occurs in some types of bacteria, members of archaea, those deep ocean producers, those chemosynthetic organisms, some nitrogen fixing bacteria, and some other soil bacteria. So make sure you are familiar with those terms. Aerobic means oxygen is required, anaerobic means oxygen is not required. And the last one is fermentation. It is also an anaerobic process, but it's not classified technically as anaerobic cellular respiration. It occurs in yeasts and the bacteria that cause milk to sour, Lactobacillus bulgaricus, and then it also occurs in the muscle cells of mammals, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, so we're going to look at aerobic cellular respiration first, and we're going to talk about a process called glycolysis. So aerobic cellular respiration, it's an oxidation reaction. There's going to be a series of enzyme catalyzed reactions which transfer electrons from high energy molecules, mainly glucose, to oxygen. It's the main method for releasing energy in the form of ATP in plants, animals, and most other eukaryotic cells. And it begins with glycolysis. And glycolysis is occurring in the cytoplasm of all cells. So very important to know where it's occurring. So glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, and it's an anaerobic process, which means it can proceed without any oxygen. All right, so let's continue looking at glycolysis. So it generates a small amount of ATP, and you'll see how much in just a sec. There is a chemical called pyruvate, which will be formed during or after glycolysis is complete. It's the product of glycolysis. It contains a large amount of chemical energy, and after it's formed, if oxygen is not available to eukaryotic cells, pyruvate will proceed through the process of fermentation. If there is oxygen, then pyruvate gets transported from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria. And then in the mitochondria, pyruvate will undergo a reaction that prepares it for entry into the Krebs cycle. All right, and we'll talk about the Krebs cycle later. We're going to focus on glycolysis today. Just a quick summary, though, about what happens in the Krebs cycle is you're going to see that there's going to be a transformation where the energy of glucose into these two molecules called NADH and FADH2. All right, now don't get these confused. In photosynthesis, we saw it was NADPH, and here it is NADH, and another one called FADH2. And these molecules, they supply high energy electrons to an electron transport system, like we saw in photosynthesis. And that's going to produce a large amount of ATP. The end product will be water. So, like I said, glycolysis, it's happening outside the mitochondria. It's happening in the cytoplasm. It occurs in all living cells. For some cells, it's the only source of energy because it can proceed without any oxygen. It can proceed anaerobically. For example, in yeast, another example is on our body muscles. They can function anaerobically for a while, but eventually those cells will need oxygen. What happens during glycolysis is it's going to take glucose and it's going to split glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. It's going to split glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate, and pyruvate are 3-carbon molecules. ATP molecules are used at the start of glycolysis, which means energy must be added to start these reactions, even though glucose itself is a high energy molecule. So ATP is required for the process of glycolysis to start. All right, and so what happens is some ATP gets synthesized and a molecule called NAD+ is reduced to NADH. The amount of ATP that is synthesized is 4. There's 4 molecules of ATP synthesized, which is greater than the amount of ATP that was used to start the process. So 2 molecules of ATP are required to start glycolysis, and then 4 molecules are made during glycolysis. So the net gain is 2 molecules of ATP. When glycolysis is complete, there is going to be 2 identical 3-carbon molecules of pyruvate, and like I said before, if there is enough oxygen present, pyruvate will enter the matrix of the mitochondria to start the Krebs cycle. All right, so here is just a diagram showing what is happening to glucose during glycolysis. All right, so here is the glucose, the 6-carbon molecule, and it is being split into these intermediate 3-carbon molecules, but the end result of glycolysis is 2 pyruvates, which are 2 3-carbon molecules. And we can also see that it required 2 ATP molecules to start, and then 4 ATP molecules are synthesized, so the net gain is 2 ATP. So it generates a small amount of ATP, but there's also a generation of NADH as well, which we just talked about right here. So ATP was synthesized as well as NAD plus gets reduced to NADH, which isn't shown in this diagram, but I wanted to mention that again. All right, so the 4 main stages of aerobic cellular respiration is glycolysis, which we just talked about. Glucose gets split into 2 3-carbon compounds called pyruvate. Small amount of ATP is produced, and it can proceed without oxygen, and it's occurring in the cytoplasm. All right, and like I said before, if there is enough oxygen present, then that pyruvate will now enter the mitochondria. If there isn't enough oxygen, then it's going to go to the process of fermentation. All right, so the Krebs cycle preparation would be next. Then it's the Krebs cycle itself, and then the electron transport system. All right, so this is just another summary of what happened in glycolysis. So all cellular respiration starts with glycolysis. It's occurring in the cell cytoplasm. It starts with that 6-carbon glucose molecule, and it'll go through a series of oxidation reduction reactions, which will split that 6-carbon glucose into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. Pyruvate will then enter the mitochondria during an aerobic respiration and enter the Krebs cycle. Phosphorylation is another term you need to know here, which is basically the process of taking a phosphate group from ATP, which results in it becoming ADP, and attaching it to the glucose molecule. That is called phosphorylation. And that activates the glucose and starts the process of glucose being broken down into those 2 3-carbon molecules. And this is just showing that process of phosphorylation, taking that phosphate group from ATP and attaching it to the glucose molecule. That is called phosphorylation. It will activate glucose and allow it to get broken down into those 2 3-carbon molecules. As well, electrons are donated to 2 molecules of NAD plus to form the 2 molecules of NADH. And again, 2 molecules of ATP were required at the beginning of glycolysis, and 4 ATP are formed. So the net energy yield here is 2 ATPs and 2 NADH molecules. All right, just some quick questions here. Where does glycolysis occur? It occurs in the cytoplasm, but it can occur in the cytoplasm of any cell. Does glycolysis occur without oxygen? And glycolysis can occur anaerobically. It does not require oxygen. And what are the 3 products of glycolysis? So we saw ATP, NADH, as well as pyruvate. All right, there are a couple videos to watch here on cellular respiration. The videos will go further into cellular respiration, and we've only talked about the first part today, which was glycolysis. So here, the next part of the lesson will be how pyruvate will enter or get ready to enter the mitochondria for the Krebs cycle. But we're going to stop here and we will watch this quick video.